Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for Civil Society's semi-sesquicentennial themed, I think I said that right, webinar on the American ideals of charity. This is part of many things we're doing at the center to bring attention to the semi-sesquicentennial, which is July 4th, 2026. We are doing webinars, podcasts, articles on Philanthropy Daily, big conference in Philadelphia in this November. But I'm really, really pleased today to have with me two great scholars, Brad Berzer and Jacob Wolf, and we're going to discuss the roots of what Tocqueville found in America when he came here, and how do they relate to our formal founding in 1776? Do they? Or are the roots elsewhere? And then we're going to look at civil society and charity as it is now in America, if we have time for that. So we have 1 hour, and if you want to ask questions, there's something at the bottom of the Zoom thing where it's a Q&A box where you can do that, and I'll try and get the questions in. So once again, I want to thank Jacob and Brad. You will find their bios in the on the side there. They'll be posted. I'll give them to you quickly. Brad is a professor of history at Hillsdale College, I think, in 26 years now.
Yeah,
Brad,
that's right, Jake.
yeah, he's the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies there. Brad serves on numerous boards, Free Enterprise Institute, Center for Cultural Renewal. He's founder of the Imaginative Conservative, which is how I first met Brad. He writes for anything and everything. He's a machine. You remind me a lot of Bill Buckley. Just I don't know how you sleep, Brad. Author of several important books. One I think we'll touch on today, and maybe even two. Your book, American Cicero, about the biography of Charles Carroll, and then you've got a biography of Andrew Jackson. I think I'm going to sneak in a question on that, Brad. I didn't let you know about that ahead of time. A biography of Russell Kirk also. Jacob Wolf is a member of the founding faculty at University of Austin in Texas, and he is because he had so much spare time, he agreed to become the interim dean of the Center for Economics, Politics, and History. He writes frequently perspectives on political science reviewer, public discourse. I saw a piece recently at Law and Liberty. He's got his doctorate from Boston College. I don't know if that's the better of the two major Jesuit colleges in Massachusetts. I say that as a graduate of Holy Cross myself. Jacob, I'm so thrilled that you are here. Gentlemen, let me just state what we're doing here, and then have a longish question to get to the meat of this premise, this supposition, which could be wrong, that 1776 and Tocqueville in 1831 have a very strong link. But uh, I'll begin this way. There were still founders alive when Tocqueville came to America in 1831 to find that uniquely American thing, voluntary civic associations, and they were thriving. This sharp departure from the European model, that's what Tocqueville was familiar with, of reliance on government or royalty to address ills and provide common necessities, proved central to the French political philosopher's historic and definitional work, Democracy in America. So we're going to have a scholarly discussion here. There are two scholars here, and one is not a scholar. That's me. About the institutional and spiritual roots of America's distinct way of loving thy neighbor, and how that fits into this broader issue, or not issue, moment of marking America's 250th anniversary as a nation. So after that windbaggery, more. I I want to know if we can connect the dots between the founding of America and the reality that Tocqueville observed when he came to these shores, that we were a nation of self-reliant joiners and instigators of voluntary associations. Was there something about our formal founding as a nation, of a revolution of 1776? Was there something about that and this 1831 flourishing of civil society that was thriving at that time and that continued through the 19th century and into the 20th century, maybe on the wane now? So, are there dots to connect 1776, 1831, and beyond? And Brad, I'd like you to lead off with your thoughts on that important question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jack, and thanks for having me on. And I'm very glad to be doing this with you and Jacob. Wonderful. Today is the feast of Saint Boniface for the those Catholics among us, which is a day to have beer.
Beer.
I think, yeah, but he is the patron saint of beer,
Yep.
which is just great. But no, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about with this, Jack, and I think it's critical to understanding the American DNA. I was at a Liberty Fund conference just a few weeks ago in Montreal, and the conference was on the French Revolution and on Napoleon. And it's really fascinating then when we look at the French and the French Revolution, there's such an understanding of the collective and of the nation. And it just struck me that it's radically different than what we have in the American understanding, which comes so much, I think, more profoundly out of the Western tradition and especially out of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of England. And that is that we believe that law and culture and customs really come from the ground up rather than from the top down. And that's where we see that the French model is just diametrically opposed to what's going on in the American system and the American way of thinking. And I think that's what de Tocqueville, who of course himself is French, but had, his family had barely survived the French Revolution, and he was very adamantly against the French Revolution and the ideas that still lingered from the French Revolution. I think that de Tocqueville had a much more Anglo-Saxon mindset, especially when it came to law and to customs, to voluntary associations. And so that's something that the Americans were incredibly good at. And, I think even if we go back to the very first settlement at Jamestown, or if we go to the settlement in New England at Plymouth Rock, we have these groups that are coming in, these local communities. And I think at the time, of course, I was just joking a moment ago that it's the Feast of St. Boniface, but I think there was something profound in Protestantism at the time that allowed for a kind of flourishing of the everyman, of every person to be able to come forward and to promote their own community, to live in their own community, to sustain their own community. So we see that especially with the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock and what they were able to do. We now call their document that they created the Mayflower Compact, but that name wasn't actually given to that document until the 1790s. And it was in the 1790s that the Massachusetts Historical Society was somewhat embarrassed about the religious roots of Massachusetts. And so they were trying to secularize it. But the original name of the Mayflower Compact was the Plymouth Combination. And combination is the English word meaning covenant. And I think that's, again, very important that when we recognize what Americans are doing, it is deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition of creating community. And I think Americans have done extremely well at promoting that community and allowing community to sustain the republic and to sustain the nation rather than the reverse of what the French were trying to do.
Well, we're going to get a little deeper into some of those colonial roots that you just raised. Governor Winthrop's sermon in 1630. I'll ask that in a little bit. But back to this question of the of 1776 and 1830. It was an event, right? Revolution. We had an event. And we have a premise that could be false, that we have this civil society burgeoning because of our founders. There was something they did then that was instrumental or a key ingredient, etc. So I'll give you another crack at that in a bit, Brad. But back to Jacob. What do you have any thoughts on that timeline?
Yeah, I think the founders intentionally built in something that's really important, which is federalism, right? That we don't have this top-down imposition, but that we actually do this kind of building from the bottom up. And partly that's a kind of retroactive acceptance of something that had been going on for basically 150 years before the founding, which is the benign neglect of England, right, left us to govern ourselves. And so by that time, we kind of just had the habit of doing things ourselves and not waiting for other people and doing that in a local community. And that was flourishing by the time that Tocqueville got there. And it was sort of ratified by our Constitution that that would be the order of doing things, right? That you'd start at the lowest level and work your way up and have this kind of voluntary association that Tocqueville so liked. I do think there is a religious element to it. I think the covenantal aspect is really important. But the mere fact that we broke from Britain and it gave us a chance to, consider whether or not we need to stick with these political institutions, with these religious institutions, or if we can build anew, I think that's part of the founding spirit of America is the chance to build anew, to build better, to not just accept what history passed down, right? This is in Federalist One, where we no longer have to depend upon accident or force, but upon reason and choice. And so that I think is just built into our DNA, and Tocqueville really liked what he saw just a few decades later.
I wonder if we had any choice in the matter. I say we as an American, although I was not back looking at Squanto on the shores of Plymouth Bay. But you don't have government officials with you. You're on your own. You have almost free reign, although again it's not like there weren't people, Indians and Native Americans living there at the time, but you're left to your own devices. So I just wonder if those circumstances kind of that was a reality that
Yeah,
forced this, but only forced to be maybe because it was a sense of true religious belief as part of that.
right.
Yeah, I would add this, Jack. Jacob, I don't mean to interrupt you if you
You're
wanted
good.
to jump in on that. But I do think that there is something particular about the Protestantism of the time. And again, I think if this were the 1200s and we were dealing with Catholics, I think Catholics would have done the same thing. And we see it, for example, with the Magna Carta in 1215, this taking of one's own governance and being able to do that. But there was something very specific about a kind of Puritan Protestantism in the early 1600s that did allow it to flourish in the sense that it allowed real community to flourish. And I think that I mean, there's a community aspect to that Protestantism, but there's also a pretty radical individualism that comes with that Protestantism as well. And I don't want to create a false dichotomy. I think we can be both individuals and communitarians at the same time. That is, I think individualism flourishes within community, and community best flourishes when there's a strong individualism as well. And so I think that's something that especially the Calvinists of the 1600s had figured out and had been able to do very well. And I look to someone like George Carey or Donald Lutz, who did great work on this. Both of them have passed away, unfortunately, but they did just incredible work looking at the covenantal elements of community in America. And again, I want to stress it's not community or individualism, but it's both together at the same time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I might speak to that.
sure.
This is a
Yeah,
topic that really interests me because it's a real paradox in Tocqueville that the sort of driving force that he sees coming out of democracy is this individualism, this desire to retreat to your own group of friends and family and to keep broader society at bay. But then we're also a nation of joiners. So how does this work? How do we get together to do anything? Right. So Tocqueville remarks he sees a tree fall over a road in America and sees people spontaneously get together, and someone says, "Hey, we need this guy to bring his horse and cart over here," and we kind of cooperate to solve this problem. And he says, in France, what would have happened is everyone would have stood around and sent someone to go talk to the government officials and waited for someone from the hierarchy to do the job. Right. So, how in America do we have this opposite view, which is you spontaneously combine to just solve problems? And so he's fascinated by this paradox. And I do think the answer has to do with Puritanism, which has this high view of the individual and individual conscience, but also because of the awareness of sin, suggests that a person in isolation following their own desires is actually kind of the essence of sin and needs to be bounded by and raised up by a community who calls them to a higher thing, right? So this is usually talked about in the literature as institutional individualism, that you're only a true individual in a community, especially a religious community, which calls you to higher and better things.
Yeah.
And
I'm going off script here, but what you just talked about with on Tocqueville reminded me, because I live on Turner Classic Movies, about even a communist like Dalton Trumbo, and he wrote the script for a beautiful movie, Our Vines Have Tender Grapes, with Edgar G. Robinson. Um, and the barn burns down and the community comes together actually at a church, and then they start one by one. Well, I'll donate 10 bales of hay, and I'll donate a cow and goats, etc. And even a commie Hollywood in the 1940s somehow was imbuing uh, um, Tocqueville. Uh,
yeah,
back. Let's get back to the pre-colonials. We're talking about the Puritans and the proclivity to voluntary association. And here's what I mentioned: John Winthrop, and he was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, and he preached a famous sermon. I'm sure, Brad, you, Jacob, could probably know this in your sleep. And a central part of the sermon, it's titled "A Model of Christian Charity." He says we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work. So, again, we're talking about large part about 1776. Maybe the founders really didn't have all that much to do on this point of civil society. Was it already baked in the cake? Um, Jacob, you want to talk about that, and then you, Brad?
yeah, that seems to be Tocqueville's point of view, that there's already this spirit of association that the founders could kind of count on and build accordingly. But it took, 150 years to develop. And I think looking to the Puritans is really important to understand this. Since we're talking about charity, I think his definition of charity in that piece is really interesting, if only because it sounds so different from how we think about love today. And in that distinction, we might find why we distrust institutions and why we're not so charitable to one another. But he says that charity or love is a bond of perfection. So there's a sort of subjective element to it, a sentimental element to it, but it also seeks another person's perfection or good, right? So it's not inconsistent with a notion of charity to actually discipline someone, to call someone to be higher than they are, to set aside their appetites and desires, right? Contrast that with how we talk about love today, which is a kind of bland affirmation of whatever people desire,
Yeah.
right? And there, I think you can start to see the kind of breakdown of community, because charity is this kind of active force that seeks out another person's good. And if you have that as your highest duty, community is going to sort of naturally follow. But if your definition of charity is to just basically leave people alone and tolerate them, then there's no active engagement. In fact, to be a good person is to leave everyone else alone. You pat yourself on your back when you don't harm another person, and that's the essence of being good, rather than this kind of proactive community building.
Yeah. Brad, any thoughts on that before I make a
Yeah,
comment about
a
my wife
couple.
trying to make me perfect? But go ahead.
Yeah, no, a couple of thoughts on that. And I love what Jacob just said. And I think, well, I'd like to make 2 points. One, I think, again, it's really important that when we look at someone like Winthrop, he is deeply rooted in a scriptural tradition. And his idea of community is really the body of Christ. That is what he's thinking of the church as. And we know that even though the Puritans were trying to purify the Church of England from papist influences, even they were not willing. It's one of the great differences between the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The Puritans were not willing to leave the overall Christian church, and they would recognize that even Catholics were a part of that. They may adamantly disagree with Catholics, but they still recognize them all as one body. And so when Winthrop is arguing about this body of Christ and the city upon a hill, I think we have to remember that that city upon a hill is both a glorious thing and a huge burden. They have to do everything right in order to be a model for the rest of the world. And that's an incredible burden. It's a glorious burden, but it's an incredible burden. And I think that that is deeply rooted in the American DNA that we have this duty, and it can be arrogance at times, but we also have this duty to live up to that commission that God has given us. And I think it's a great tension in American history, and again in American culture. But the second thing I would add to that, because you're asking specifically about the founders,
Right.
there's no doubt that the founders had the habit of self-government, right? They had been governing themselves. The Americans had been governing themselves for 150 years when we get to the Declaration of Independence, and they had pretty much been left alone. But I think that the founders were proactive about this. I don't think that they just received this and passed it on. And I'm especially, and this is one thing I drill into my students here at Hillsdale. I am very taken with the Old Northwest Ordinance of
Yeah.
1787. And there was a time in American history, for example, my grandparents, and I'm 57, so my grandparents have been gone a while. But for people of my grandparents' generation, they had to memorize parts of the Northwest Ordinance in order to pass high school. And it was, the same kind of thing. You had to know the Declaration, you had to know the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Old Northwest Ordinance. Our generation has kind of forgotten that, and I think that's terrible. But if we look to Article 2 of the Northwest Ordinance, it says quite clearly that politics cannot interfere with community. That is, politics has its own sphere of things, but community has a separate sphere. And so there can't be politicized decisions that overturn a local community unless some fundamental violation of the law has occurred. And we look at something like the Fifth Amendment and the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment. But even before the Bill of Rights with the Northwest Ordinance, the founders were very serious about this, that property, not just ownership of stuff, but actual agreement. So you and Jacob and I could start a church, or we could start a
Right.
school, or we could start a business, or my wife and I could start a family. Those are things that are absolutely fundamental to the American founding. And I think they're older than the founding, but the founders were very proactive about making sure that we had that kind of freedom to create our own communities without interference of politics.
Brad, false humility is a sin, as you know. And would you consider yourself the expert on the Northwest Ordinance, or is there some? I'm serious, as it's not,
Well,
when
I,
you brought this up ahead of time, like, who talks about that at all anywhere, except at
Yeah, I
Hillsdale?
do. I love the Northwest Ordinance. And Jack, you and I know each other well enough. You know when I like something, I get pretty
Yeah,
enthusiastic.
yeah, yeah.
So I may be the greatest enthusiast for the Northwest Ordinance. I don't know if I'm the expert on
Is
it.
there a particular scholar today who is
Yeah, probably the person who's done the most work on it is Peter Onuf at the University of Virginia.
okay?
Has probably, and he's retired now. But yeah, Onuf, Onuf, has done really good scholarly work on it.
Okay, that's terrific because I think the Center for Civil Society we should delve into this, and we will. Jacob, and by the way, Brad, I want to come back to you because when we had talked earlier before the webinar, there was a counterpoint to what was going on in France while we were producing the Northwest Ordinance. But Jacob, do you have any thoughts about what Brad just said?
Yeah, I think the existence of sort of pre-political communities is really important, and the American Constitutional Order does try to protect that. Um, when I look to, for example, the Puritans, it's really hard to separate out sort of the politics from the religion and culture. And I've done a lot of work of looking at, for example, like the Puritan meeting houses. This is the main fixture of any town, right? It's where you hold your political assemblies. It's where you gather on Sundays for church. And so the same religious community is the same people who are deciding your political issues as well. And so having this kind of bond of fraternity, although not fraternity exactly in the French sense, but this kind of brotherly love for one another, is I think, assumed and necessary for solid political decision making. And I think the founders really wanted to preserve that, and that's why federalism is so important. It's why, in fact, the federal government does so few things. We forget about this, and now that we have a federal government that does just about everything, but it was meant to be very small and limited and have very little revenue because so much was supposed to be done at the state and local level.
Right.
And that is just something that's been totally inverted. And I think part of our lack of civic engagement is just because the growth of government has pushed people out of spheres that they once inhabited, and it's been taken up as government work.
Yeah, to quote the great Scrooge, "Are there no poorhouses?" Right? Yeah,
Mhm.
that's. Brad, you had wanted to talk about the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Yes.
Yeah, just a little bit, Jack. There's an incredible moment. It's in Article 3 and then again in Article 6 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And I don't have it right in front of me, but the way it reads in especially Article 3 of the Declaration says that all community resides essentially in the nation. That is, all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. And that is, that's where Edmund Burke read this, and he was horrified by what was happening in France because it was this radical collectivism, this radical nationalism that was going on. And again, I think as Americans, we build our communities. So you and I have a friendship. Jacob and I have a friendship. The three of us are making this little community for an hour right now, and we build out from that. But if we're to take the French literally in their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, nothing can happen without the permission of the whole. So there can be no church, there can be no business, there can be no school, there can be no marriage, nothing without the whole agreeing to it. And I think we've moved in that direction as Americans. I think, a terrible way to go, but we have moved in that direction where everything really has become centralized. And, even not to get too political about this, I have no problem if Harvard loses its money that the federal government is providing for it. But that's a totally different thing than them losing their tax status, their tax
Right.
exempt status. And that's something that's deeply rooted in the American tradition that we allow for communities to flourish in that manner. And again, it's very different from what the French were trying to do in their revolution. So I know a lot of textbooks will talk about the great revolutions of Western civilization and they'll mix the American and the French. But that's just not the case. The case is that they were radically different revolutions, even though we use the same term to explain both of them.
I want to recommend to our viewers, and this will be on YouTube, so people might see this. We'll see this over the years and the centuries, even that if you go to the Imaginative Conservative, which Brad founded, and you look up, actually today, the top of the Imaginative Conservative is a great piece, Brad, that you had written about St. Boniface and drinking beer. So I just want to note that. Dan Mahone. Actually, it was because of your book on Carroll, and I think we're going to talk about two of the founders and how they relate to all these issues we're talking about today. One is Charles Carroll, but then George Washington. But reading your Carroll book, I was interested in finding the notes of Beaumont and Tocqueville, so I went out and bought this, big
Oh, yeah. That's a
honking
beautiful
book.
addition.
Yeah, by Olivier Zunz. He's the editor, but he said something in it that was interesting and maybe troubling, to me anyway, about Washington and as relates to associations. And here's what Zunz wrote. Associations were a more contentious issue than Tocqueville realized. The founding fathers had been worried that associations could detract from a common good, and if they attained sufficient political power, enforce the will of a minority against the majority. George Washington and his 1796 farewell address denounced, quote, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character, end quote, as quote unquote destructive of the quote duty of every individual to obey established government, etc. Um, wow, that's like if George Washington was alive in 1831, would he have been miffed about what Tocqueville was observing? I told this to Dan Mahoney, and Dan was like, "Yeah, he started a long lecture on why Sons was wrong." But any thoughts? Is there some there about George Washington and associations?
Jacob, do
Jacob,
you want
you
to
want
take
to?
Yeah,
that?
I'll give it a shot. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think particularly what Washington and the founders more broadly are worried about is when an association can become a faction. That means it puts its interests against those of the common good and depends on taking away the rights of other people, right? This is Madison and Fed 10, for example. So when an association becomes injurious of other associations, that's
okay,
when you should really fear it. And this is why Washington is also so afraid of party, is it can be this kind of association that's all consuming. It subsumes your entire identity, and it's injurious to the other side because it becomes a kind of black and white Manichaean struggle. And I think there are some associations that Washington and the founders would like because they don't just correspond to one's interests so easily. For example, churches and schools, they have what sociologists call cross-cutting pressures, right? It brings together people of different classes and different backgrounds and different interests in terms of employment, and it puts them all together in the same room, and you have to figure out how to get together. That's the kind of association that the founders really liked, where it brings together a bunch of different people for a specific purpose that's unique to the institution and higher than the individual. Um, but a lot of institutions, in particular party, can be kind of narrowing. It can bring out the worst in people. It can just attract people who already agree on everything or have all the same material interests at heart. So that, I think, distinction is really important. Is this an institution with cross-cutting pressures that's going to bring people together of different backgrounds? Or is it the kind that's just going to gather people who already agree and it's just going to exacerbate passions and so on, right? So the founders liked the former and disliked the latter.
okay. Brad, if you want to say anything about that, but then I do want to press you on Charles Carroll.
Sure. I agree completely with what Jacob just said, and I think he said it beautifully. It is really interesting, and you find this, it's in James Fenimore Cooper, it's in other things, especially in the early Republic. So basically from about Jefferson's administration up through Andrew Jackson's administration, there was this great question about how does a republic allow for associations to flourish, especially if the associations are secretive. And so this is not something we
Right.
talk about so much in history, and I think we should. But if you look, the formation of the first major political party is the Democratic Party in 1827. But the attempt to fight that, actually, the opposition to the Democratic Party was a party called the Anti-Mason
Masonic,
Party.
yeah.
And, part of the argument of the anti-Masons was it's one thing to have associations, it's another thing to have secretive associations within a republic. So there is a great tension in the early republic trying to figure out how do you balance those. But I would go back to Jacob's point. I think that if we look at the Federalist Papers overall, and Washington, of course, would be very much in line with the writers of the Federalist, that they were worried that these associations could become a hindrance to the republic. But as long as they weren't that, as long as they upheld the republic, for example, the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island,
Right.
or the Catholic Diocese of Maryland, whatever it may be, those were the kinds of things that Washington was very much in favor of. So I think that my sense is overall the founders were very much in favor of associations as long as they didn't hurt the republic overall.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Maryland and Catholics, and that leads us to Charles Carroll, who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was the last surviving signer. He died in, I think, 1832. He was the richest man in America, maybe, when he signed the
Right.
Declaration, and he may have also still been the richest man in America when he died. uh, at the end of the Declaration, there's, about risking your life and your fortunes, and if anyone had a lot to risk, he certainly had the most. He was the only Catholic signer, and his story, Brad, is your beautiful biography of him. Boy, oh boy, talk about intolerance and having to leave America for what, 17 years? He left to study abroad. But anyway, he's a fascinating individual. I'm I just would like you to talk somewhat about him, particularly. Oh, he met Tocqueville. So that was the other thing. We're talking about Tocqueville
Yeah.
here. They actually met, but it doesn't seem there's any evidence they talked about the things we're talking about, voluntary associations, etc. Tocqueville doesn't comment on it. Beaumont doesn't comment on it. But uh, anything you want to say about Carroll, and also why he may should still matter to us today in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, Jack, I'm so biased because I spent so much time with him that I just think he's such a fascinating figure. And, again, we've forgotten him for the most part in American history. But in 1796, he was actually considered by Alexander Hamilton as a possibility for running for the presidency against John Adams. And that's how much he had, in 1773, he can't vote. But
Right.
as of 1796, he was being considered for the presidency. So that's pretty stunning to think about that. And I don't think he would have had a chance, actually. But regardless, the fact that Hamilton would have thought that highly of him, I think does matter. He is important because he's probably, along with John Dickinson, the most formally educated of all of our founders. He actually had an MA in philosophy. And then he also had degrees in law, both civil law and common law as well. And so that's pretty amazing. But I love the guy for his spirit, for what he brought to it. I think had he not come from an oppressed people earlier on, I think he would not have had quite the verve that he had when he was advocating the founding. But when he signs the Declaration of Independence, he says he's doing this because he believes it's introducing into the world religious tolerance. And that's incredible,
Yeah.
especially when we think about how, again, one of those things that we get wrong so often in history. We talk about America and all the colonies as if they're religiously tolerant and have
Uh,
religious liberty. But of course, that's exactly the opposite of what was going on in the colonies. You could practice what religion the colony advocated, but nothing else. And the Catholics were hated in the colonies, but the Baptists were equally hated. And that's just something we rarely talk about in American history. And I think that's unfortunate. So Carol comes out of that intolerance, really fights against it. And of course, just by the fact he's so intelligent and that he lives to age 95, he doesn't die until November 14th of 1832. That's stunning. But
right.
he gets a full almost 10 year, not quite, but a half decade after Jefferson and Adams, right? Really incredible to think about. So there's something about him that I think creates a kind of great symbol for what the founding is, especially into the 1830s. And Jack, I'll just throw this in as well because I love it. When he dies, the two headlines that go out across the United States are "A great man in Israel hath passed, and the last of the Romans is dead." And
Yeah.
if you could be a prophet and a Roman Republican.
He
So
was it.
I think you've made it if you could be
Yeah.
both of those things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's a link to Brad's book, and actually, there's a link on for Amazon for all the books Brad has written. You'll find it in the chat. By the way, in the chat, maybe you'll take this, Jacob. Ashley writes, "Beautiful and vital conversation. How may we better articulate the distinction between voluntary socialism versus radical collectivism? Are there practical steps we may take away and apply the founder's vision to our lives and modern conundrums, of course, beyond only the political?" You have any thought on that, Jacob?
Yeah, I mean that's a really wonderful question and something that's pretty hard to answer. What's the difference between a kind of voluntary association and the kind of collectivism that seems destructive? Um, Voluntary association, in the way that the founders like it, is directed towards some positive good, right? Whether that's the purification of society. You see all these voluntary associations that are trying to clean up, for example, the morals of society. It could be practical to create roads or to be a kind of police force. The kind of tribalism that I see going on in the kind of collectivism we are afraid of and that Tocqueville was afraid of seems to be attached to the denigration of some other group, right? That might be a political party that's not your own, right? We talk a lot about political polarization. We're at a kind of fever pitch there, and it seems like you'll do anything in your group as long as it harms the other group. Or it could be a kind of ethnic collectivism or tribalism that seems injurious because it assumes a kind of zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. Um, I don't know exactly how to parse it other than it seems to be that the voluntary associations foster common good, and the kind of collectivism seeks the harm of a specific minority or perhaps even majority group.
Yeah.
Brad,
Let
do
me
you want to clarify it maybe?
Oh, I think that's great, Jacob. Again, I would remind all of us that we are a republic, not a democracy. And the
That's right.
idea of the republic comes from the common good. So that's not radical collectivism, but it does believe strongly in community. And I would argue that the kind of republic that we as Americans have is a community of communities. And again, not to negate the individual. We still believe very strongly in the individual, but we're always, and Jacob, you had brought up earlier, this is really federalism. This is what we're doing here. It's not just state versus federal, it's state versus federal versus local versus private. And I would say no matter what, and because we're in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we don't believe just in the collective. We believe in the collective that advocates the dignity of the human person
Yeah.
in some way. Yeah, and that's deeply rooted in our declaration with
Yeah.
the rights that we see guaranteed by or
Yeah.
espoused by the declaration.
And
I,
it seems like the collectivism, especially of the 20th century, becomes especially pernicious when the state or the nation functions as God, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing higher or above the interests of the nation or the state. Um, that's a somewhat later development, but it seems to be where this becomes really bad because all these other associations assume they're under some kind of moral framework or universe that dictates right behavior and so on. But when you just simply make the states or the nation's interests God, then these associations can become really, really dangerous.
yeah. I wanted to spend a little time on the early 1830s when Tocqueville is here in America. And Brad, let me ask you first about um, Andrew Jackson. He is president when Tocqueville comes to America. He should have been president. Maybe he should have been serving his second term instead of his first term. But and you've written about you have a biography of Andrew Jackson. Does Andrew Jackson's presidency and his of the time MAGA movement have is it fertilizer for the growth of voluntary associations and this thriving, this outpouring? Is there a connect between Jacksonianism and what Tocqueville found?
Yeah, there is. And, I will admit from a personal perspective, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Jackson. There are things about him that I think are extraordinary. Of all the persons that I've had the privilege of studying, he may be the most honest, and brutally so at times. But there's
Yeah.
nothing false about the man that I could find. If he believes something, he said it. Now, I don't always agree with everything he said, but I admired him for having that kind of view of politics and being so open about his own beliefs. But I think one place where we can see, okay, so let me put it this way, Jack. Uh, I think in a lot of ways, when we talk about Jacksonianism and we talk about the Jacksonian period, we really are putting forward voluntary associations because they're so critical to that time period. And I think of someone, one of my favorite books is on a little town in Illinois by a guy named Don Harrison Doyle. And I can't remember the title of the book right now, but it's just what it does is it takes one community and it looks at all the different voluntary associations of that community. So Don Harrison Doyle is the author's name. And what he's trying to do with that, it's really stunning. And it is very Jacksonian. But the other thing I would say about Jackson is that if we really believed in associations, we would also recognize Indian tribes. And that's
Yeah.
something that Jackson
Yeah.
really has a bad,
Yeah.
there's no way around it. I mean, he violated that association among the Indians in the American South and then removed them to the West. Uh, and so at one level, when it comes to whites, he's really good. At another level, when it comes to the American Indians, he's pretty bad about this. But I do think overall, if we want to just take a kind of neutral view, really associationalism is advanced by Jacksonianism more than it's retarded.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Jacob, we had a podcast here for you, not, yes, podcast, Jeremy Beer with John Pinero. I hope I said his name right, from the Acton Institute. And it was terrific listen. And Pinero said something to the effect that when Tocqueville came at the time, what was really the gasoline in the engine of the growth of voluntary associations was the Second Great Awakening. And I kind of pulled back a little because I was thinking, well, it really has to do with the founders, but you know, what if there wasn't a second Great Awakening? Would we have had a vibrant civil society? Anyway, do you have any thoughts on the influence of the Great Awakening on what Tocqueville found?
Yeah, I do think it's really important. I think it's important because, I mean, Tocqueville's sitting in the background of the whole discussion. When he talks about American exceptionalism, since we're sort of talking about that, he says
Right,
one of the things that we have to know about the Americans is they have, by virtue of a kind of empty territory and a necessity of building everything anew, there's a kind of acquisitiveness that sneaks in that becomes a kind of materialism, a tendency towards which all Americans are really prone.
right,
And for Tocqueville, religion is the thing that turns you away from simple money making and pragmatic concerns. He has really beautiful passages where he says that religion turns your eyes upward toward immaterial things and outward towards one's fellows. And I see the Second Great Awakening playing into this. It has this um, idea of not just concerning yourself with your business or your busyness, and actually having to help your fellows to think about immaterial good things, right, and rather than just material goods. And so the Second Great Awakening, I think, fits into this question because it forestalls materialism, which is the thing that can derail the kind of an American experiment and our associationalism, right? So that's kind of how I see the Second Great Awakening.
you also write a lot about religion and democracy and the balancing act that's
Right.
required. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I take a lot of it from Tocqueville, so I'm sort of channeling his spirit here. But he says democracy is a great thing that's coming, but it comes with certain flaws that everyone needs to be aware of. And one of those is individualism, this tendency for people to retreat from public society into their family or a close circle of their friends and to kind of leave politics to the politicians, right? He says that this is actually inherent in America. Materialism is the other problem too, given that we just need to build things and there's immense opportunity afforded by this kind of errand into the wilderness that we have. And we have a sort of pragmatic orientation because you just have to accomplish things, you have to survive. He says individualism and materialism are the two things that might derail democracy. And so, if you want democracy to be on the right track, you need something that stops that. And for Tocqueville, that's religion, partly because of charity, that makes you think beyond yourself and think about the common good, but then also thinking about the transcendental, permanent things also turns your mind away from the material, right? So when you think about heaven, are no longer attached to your earthly possessions just so much, right? But the problem is, it's not just an easy counterbalance. You have religion and then individualism and materialism are held at bay because individualism and materialism can rework the religion itself, right? So it might serve as a counterbalance, but it might also change. And this is a
Right.
problem I see in modern religion, which is rather than forestalling individualism, it's become really individualistic, right? Since COVID now, the number of people who attend church by streaming church online has grown exponentially, such that it's about 10% of the population now. Church participation is down. Church membership is almost non-existent because churches don't even think about membership for the most part. And to say that religion forestalls materialism, well, there's really popular churches that preach if you're a Christian, you're all of a sudden going to be wealthy. So there's a way in which individualism and materialism can be forestalled by religion, but it can also remake religion in its own image. And this is the kind of tension that I spend a lot of my time studying, which is winning.
Yeah. Fascinating. Brad, a kind of a free range question here on Robert Nisbet, Russell Kirk, and Tocqueville are on a cloud somewhere having a conversation right now and looking at what America was as a land of vibrant um voluntary associations and what it has become and what they fear it might continue might further become. Any reflections on how Nisbet and Tocqueville might have such a
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, Jack. And my guess is you could probably answer this better than I could, especially with what you're doing with AmPhil. It strikes me that no matter what, and I realize, being conservative, we are down on what's going on with community in the state. But I would say even with everything negative that's happening with government taking over community, we as Americans still very strongly believe in community. I
yeah,
think it's part of who we are. And, I imagine, when we look at something in the world, let's say that there's a tsunami somewhere in the Pacific, immediately it's the Red Cross and it's
right,
Doctors Without Borders that show up. None of us, as much as we might love Australia, none of us expect the Australians to arrive, even if it's in their neighborhood, to help people. We're always looking to the Americans to do this.
yeah,
Again, Mennonite Aid Association, whatever it may be, we are still really good at this. So I think it's taken a blow. That is, our desire for association and community has really, especially since the progressive era, has been harmed significantly. And yet, despite that, we still have these things. We still have a National Review. We still have a Hillsdale College. We still have an AmPhil. We're creating these things all the time, and so there is, I think, something in this. And where I live in Hillsdale, we're just on the north side of town. But for that one year, I lived in Longmont, Colorado, 10 years ago, and we were in a regulated neighborhood. It was under a homeowners association. And
Yeah.
some of the rules drove me crazy. I didn't take care of my yard as well as I should have, and they would show up and say, "Brad, you got to cut this down." But they were right. I mean, now that I look back on it, I think they were, even at the time, if it annoyed me, I think they were right. And I appreciate that the community can have that kind of power and that kind of pull. And so again, it's not always perfect. There are all kinds of flawed communities as well. And we have an extremely powerful nation state. But I still think there's something instinctive in the American character that Kirk and Nisbet and de Tocqueville would appreciate.
We have 5 minutes left, and I know there's a question here, but let me see if we can get to that quickly because I want to ask both of you quickly. Maybe we'll end with your view, your definition of what is American exceptionalism. But let me just quickly get in here from Trinity. De Tocqueville discusses how Americans tend to have a bifurcated life where their day-to-day choices are seen as compartmentalized from their religious involvement. Is this a uniquely American problem? Jacob, why don't you take that on?
Yeah, Tocqueville has some funny thoughts about this. He does say Sunday is the day where people are exceptionally religious. That's when they really take it seriously. The rest of the week, they're sort of pragmatic by orientation. But he does say that the morality of Christianity pervades every day of the week.
Yeah.
Right? So they may not be thinking theologically or ritualistically Monday through Friday, but the morals that they learned in church on Sunday pervade everything that they do. They bring it into the practical sphere. So he
Right.
does say that there's a kind of harmony there.
There's an upside to that. If you believe that today is St. Boniface's Day, you'll go out and have some beer. Jacob, let me ask you the last question, and Brad, you will close this out. Define in your way American exceptionalism, and is it part of what we're talking about? What Tocqueville was astounded by when he came
Mhm.
to America?
Yeah. I think some people like to say American exceptionalism just simply means that we're better. Tocqueville, who invents the phrase, uses it to say that we're just simply different and that democracy in America is going to look different here than anywhere else. I designed a course called The Exceptional Country, and I try to teach students in that course America's ideals, institutions, and cultures, right? So, what are our ideas that are unique, liberty and equality? Then, how do we design institutions which protect those ideals? And how do we have that surrounded in the kind of culture or moral values that lead to that sort of flourishing? And so, I think thinking for the first time in history of what's our end goal, what are the values to which we subscribe, and then building them into institutions and surrounding them with a culture that we generate bottom up. That I think is the essence of American exceptionalism. That's the idea of the city on the hill, the Statue of Liberty, that we're doing things new and the world should watch and imitate.
Maybe Obama was right. Greek is exceptional. Greece is exceptional as America's exceptional. Now,
This is the-
Brad, why don't we have 2 minutes left? And let me just say thanks, folks, who have
Oh, thank
joined
you.
us. Check out the Center for Civil Society's website and go to University of Austin's website. Check out what Jacob is doing there, and he'll get you a scholarship. Brad will get you one at Hillsdale. Go to Hillsdale. Check out Brad. Brad, what is American exceptionalism to you?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in it, and I would echo everything that Jacob just said. I think he said it beautifully. But I would add two things, and really to play upon what Jacob was saying. Number one, we are without question the most charitable people in the world.
Mm,
Nobody comes close to what we do in terms of our charity, not just among each other, but to people outside of our country as well.
right.
And I think that's beautiful. I think there's really, I think we're deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think we believe in charity. I think we believe in love. I think it can go wrong at times. It can be arrogance and it can be power, but I think the impetus for it is a very healthy one and a very good one. And the second thing I would say, and this is something that I've been working on currently in my own scholarly work, I firmly believe that the Declaration of Independence is unique in that it promotes a certain kind of equality. We have not always lived up to it, but we have always tried to live up to it. And I think our whole history is a history of bringing dignity to various peoples and allowing that dignity to flourish. And yes, we've screwed up. Time after time, we've screwed up, but we've tried so hard. And I love what Martin Luther King said about this. The Declaration is a promissory note.
Right.
And I think that our whole history has been the struggle of bringing people together and recognizing their natural rights. So, yeah, yes, we're unique, and I think we're exceptional. And in those two ways, I think it's beautiful.
Amen, brother. Brad, you've been terrific. Jacob, terrific. I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. I wish this could have gone on for another hour. You've just been so. I cannot wait to read the Northwest Ordinance now. Seriously, I want to thank my colleague Caitlin for being great help. Folks, thanks so much, Celia. Thank you, everyone, and we will be back soon with another webinar in August related to the semi-sesquicentennial. God bless America. Thanks you. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.